I've spent my entire career studying the phenomenon of paranormal sleep experiences, and I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for the series of events that unfolded when I received a cryptic message from a former patient, claiming to have witnessed something that would change the course of my life forever. I remember the day the letter arrived like it was yesterday. It was a typical Monday morning, and I was sipping on a cup of coffee in my office when I noticed a strange envelope addressed to me. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting seemed eerily familiar. As I opened the letter, a shiver ran down my spine. The words on the page were few, but they spoke volumes. Dear Doctor, I know you think you're just a skeptic, but I'm here to tell you that some things can't be explained. I've been having these dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams that feel more real than my waking life. I've tried everything to shake them off: medication, therapy, even sleep deprivation, but nothing seems to work. All I know is that when I wake up in the dead of night, I'm left with this creeping sense of dread that something's watching me from just beyond the edge of perception. If you're reading this, it means you've been down this road before. You know what I'm talking about. Meet me at the old abandoned asylum on Friday at midnight if you want to hear more. Sincerely, Lay. I had been preparing for this meeting with A for weeks, poring over case files and researching the abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. The once grand structure loomed over the surrounding landscape like a skeletal sentinel, its windows like empty eyes staring back at me. But I wasn't there to sightsee. I was there to listen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in a fiery orange glow, I made my way to the entrance of the asylum. The wind carried an eerie whisper through the crumbling facade, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and decay, the stench of rot and neglect hanging heavy over everything like a miasma. A had promised me that this place held the key to understanding the mysterious sleep phenomenon, and I was determined to uncover its secrets. As I waited for her to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the creaks and groans of the old building settling around me like a living entity. And then, just as I was starting to think I'd been stood up, I heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the hallway. They were light, tentative steps, as if someone was trying not to be seen. I turned to face her, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw it. A. Standing just beyond the edge of the light, her eyes fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. As A stepped into the dimly lit hallway, her eyes seemed to bore into my very soul. I felt a chill run down my spine as she began to walk towards me, her movements fluid and almost unnatural. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, the only sound the soft creaking of the old wooden floorboards beneath our feet. And then, without warning, A's gaze dropped, and she spoke in a low, barely audible whisper. My dreams are the worst part. I nodded, encouraging her to continue, but she just shook her head, her eyes snapping back up to meet mine with an unsettling intensity. They're like snapshots, she said, her voice trembling. Vivid, disturbing images that feel more real than my waking life. But they're not just random visions, they're connected. They all lead to the same place. A took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with an exaggerated intensity, and I could see the fear emanating from her like a palpable force. The place, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, is where I am when I wake up in the dead of night with that feeling that something's watching me. As she spoke, A's eyes seemed to glaze over, and she began to stare into some unseen distance, her body tensing as if it was about to lurch forward. And then, without warning, she lunged at me, grabbing my arm with a grip like a vice. "I've seen things," she hissed, her breath hot against my ear. "Terrible things. And I know that if you listen closely, you'll hear them too." As I looked into Ace's eyes, I saw something there that made my blood run cold. It was a look of raw terror, mixed with a sense of despair that seemed to seep from her very pores. And then, without warning, she began to speak in a low, urgent tone, as if the words themselves were a lifeline. "I've seen them," she repeated, her voice like a mantra. "The faces, the places, they're all so real." I felt a shiver run down my spine as A's gaze drifted away from mine, her eyes seeming to scan the darkness for something just beyond the edge of perception. And then, without warning, she began to speak again, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I've seen the hospital room," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The bed, the machines, everything so familiar." I felt a jolt of recognition, as if I'd heard those words before, but where? And then A's eyes snapped back to mine, her gaze burning with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "And the patient," she said, her voice dripping with dread. "The one who's been watching me from the shadows." As she spoke, the air around us seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening into dark, twisted things that writhed on the walls like living serpents. And I knew in that moment that A's nightmares were more than just vivid fantasies. They were doorways into a realm of terror that lurked just beyond the edge of reality. As Ace's words hung in the air, I felt a presence stirring just beyond the edge of perception. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a faint hum like the quiet buzzing of a fly around my ear. But then, as if something had shifted, the noise grew louder, more defined. It was a low, thrumming sound like the beat of a heart, and it seemed to be coming from all around me. Ace's eyes locked onto mine, her gaze burning with an urgent intensity. "It's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din. I felt my heart racing as I turned to face the darkness, but there was nothing to see. No shape, no form, just a vast, empty space that seemed to be watching me with cold, calculating eyes. And then, without warning, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavy with anticipation. Ace's breath caught in her throat as she spoke, her voice trembling with fear. "It's not just a sound," she whispered. It's something else." I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as I turned back to face her, my eyes scanning her face for any sign of what was happening. And then I saw it, a faint, flickering light in the corner of her eye. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, a tiny, pulsing orb that seemed to be drawing her gaze inexorably towards it. Ace's eyes were fixed on the light now, her body tensing as if she was about to lurch forward. And then, without warning, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what it is," she said, her words dripping with a mixture of fear and fascination. It's the patient." I stepped into the abandoned asylum, my heart pounding in my chest. Ace's words echoed in my mind, "It's the patient." I had to know more. As I made my way deeper into the decaying building, the air grew thick with dust and the stench of rot. I could feel the weight of history bearing down on me, the whispers of countless patients who had suffered here. And then I saw it, a small, makeshift room tucked away in a corner of the asylum. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a space that seemed frozen in time. There was a single chair, a small table with a lamp on it, and a single sheet of paper on the wall. It was Ace's handwriting, scrawled across the page in hasty, desperate strokes. "I've been trying to communicate with it," she wrote, "but it just won't listen." As I read the words, I felt a presence stirring around me. The air seemed to thicken, the shadows coalescing into something tangible. And then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of perception. It was tall and gaunt, its skin deathly pale. Its eyes were black as coal, and they seemed to bore into my very soul. "The patient," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The figure didn't move, but I could sense its gaze on me, weighing and measuring me like a specimen under glass. And then, without warning, it spoke. Its voice was low and husky, like the rustling of dry leaves. "I am the patient," it said, its words echoing through my mind. "And you are." As the patient's words hung in the air, I felt my grip on reality begin to slip. The room seemed to spin around me, the walls closing in like a vice. A's face was inches from mine, her eyes wild and frightened. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling with desperation. The patient's gaze never wavered, its black eyes boring into my soul like cold, dead weights. I felt myself being drawn into their depths, sucked down into a vortex of madness and terror. The words tumbled out of my mouth in a frantic rush. "I don't know what you want. Just leave me alone." But the patient didn't respond. Instead, it began to speak, its voice weaving a spell of utter confusion and despair. "You're not who you think you are," it hissed. "Your memories are false. You're just a puppet, a pawn in a game you don't even understand." The room seemed to dissolve around me, leaving only the patient's words echoing through my mind like a mantra of madness. I stumbled backwards, tripping over my own feet as the world spun wildly out of control. A's face blurred into focus, her eyes wide with horror. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't listen to it, it's lying." But I couldn't shake the feeling that the patient was right, that my entire life had been a lie, constructed from twisted threads of deceit and madness. The patient's words echoed in my mind, a maddening mantra of doubt and terror. And then everything went black. The darkness closed in around me like a shroud, suffocating me with its crushing weight. I was trapped in a living nightmare, with no escape from the patient's twisted mind games. A's face was etched into my memory, her eyes wild and frightened as she clung to me for support. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of madness. "Don't let it win." But I couldn't fight back. The patient's words had seeped into my mind like acid, eating away at my sanity with every passing moment. I felt myself being drawn into its vortex, sucked down into a world of madness and despair from which there was no escape. And then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, A's face hovering above me like a ghost. "You're safe now," she whispered, her eyes shining with tears, but I knew it was just an illusion. The patient's words still echoed in my mind, taunting me with their cruel truth. "You're not who you think you are." My memories were false, my life a lie. I felt like I was staring into the abyss, with no safety net to catch me if I fell. A's hand closed around mine, her grip like a vice. "We have to get out of here," she whispered, her voice urgent. But I knew we were too late. The patient had won. My mind was shattered, my sanity broken. And as the darkness closed in around me once more, I knew that I would never be whole again. I stumbled to my feet, A's hand still clutched in mine. We had to get out of there before the patient could do any more damage. The asylum seemed to stretch on forever, its corridors twisting and turning like a maze designed by madness itself. But we had to keep moving, had to find a way out before I lost myself completely. A's eyes were wild with fear, her grip on my hand tight as she pulled me through the winding corridors. We passed by rooms filled with rusting medical equipment, their surfaces etched with ancient scars from previous patients. In one room, a patient lay motionless on a hospital bed, its eyes frozen in a permanent scream of terror. I felt a shiver run down my spine as A's hand tightened around mine. "Come on," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. We emerged into bright sunlight, blinking away the darkness of the asylum's corridors. The world was a blur of colors and sounds, a cacophony of noise that threatened to overwhelm me. But I knew we had to keep moving, had to find a way to escape before the patient could catch up with us. Ace Hand led me through the streets, dodging pedestrians and cars as we made our way towards the outskirts of town. We were running out of time, but I knew I couldn't stop now. Not until I was free from this living nightmare. The city gave way to open fields and rolling hills, a breathtaking vista that took my breath away. And then in the distance I saw it, a glimmer of light on the horizon, a beacon calling me towards freedom. With Ace Hand still clutched in mine, I set off towards the light, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The patient's words echoed in my mind, taunting me with their cruel truth. You're not who you think you are. But for now, I didn't care. I was free. As we walked towards the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows cast by the trees seemed to grow longer and darker, like skeletal fingers reaching out to snatch us back. Ace Hand still clutched in mine. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how fast we walked, the sense of being watched only grew stronger. I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, a rustle of leaves, a flash of shadow, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. Ace's grip on my hand tightened, and I knew she felt it too. We were not alone. The air was thick with an almost palpable sense of menace, like the weight of unseen eyes bearing down upon us. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, my skin crawling with goosebumps. And then, just as we were about to reach the edge of the forest, a figure stepped out from behind a tree. Tall and imposing, its features obscured by the shadows, it watched us with an unblinking gaze. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that this must be the patient's doing some twisted manifestation of my own subconscious. But Ace's grip on my hand remained firm, her eyes locked on the figure with a fierce determination. "We're not going to let you win," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, but I knew it was waiting for something, waiting for us to make our next move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into thin air. We stood there, frozen in time, as the silence stretched out around us like a palpable presence. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart, revealing a glimpse of something dark and malevolent lurking just beyond the edge of perception. Ace's hand still clutched in mine. I knew that we were in this together, for better or for worse. And with that thought, we turned and walked away from the forest, leaving the lurking shadows to their secrets. As we walked away from the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being pulled back into the abyss. The patient's presence still lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the horrors that lay within. Ace's grip on my hand remained firm, but I could see the fear creeping into her eyes. We had to keep moving, had to find a way to escape before it was too late. But every step felt like a struggle, as if the very ground itself was trying to hold us back. The sky above seemed to darken, the clouds twisting and writhing like living things. I knew we were running out of time, that the patient's power was growing by the minute. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went black. I fell to the ground, Ace's hand slipping from my grasp. The world around me dissolved into chaos, a maelstrom of sound and color that threatened to consume me whole. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the void. And then I was falling, plummeting towards some unknown destination with no control over my own fate. The patient's words echoed in my mind, taunting me with their cruel truth. "You're not who you think you are." But I knew the truth now. I was nothing but a pawn in a twisted game of survival. And as I fell, I realized that there was no escape, no refuge from the horrors that lurked within. The darkness closed in around me like a shroud, and everything went black. I awoke to an empty room, the walls bare and unadorned. Ace's face was nowhere to be seen, but I knew she was gone. The patient's presence still lingered in the air, but it was no longer oppressive. Instead, It was a reminder of what I had endured, of what I had survived. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. I looked around the room, trying to remember how I got there, but everything was a blur. The last thing I remembered was falling, plummeting towards some unknown destination with no control over my own fate. And then nothing. I stumbled out of the room into a world that seemed bright and sunny after the darkness I had endured. People passed by me on the street, smiling and laughing. They didn't notice me, didn't see the pain and fear etched on my face. I was just another face in the crowd, another anonymous soul struggling to find its way. I wandered aimlessly, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I walked, the more lost I became. The patient's words still echoed in my mind, taunting me with their cruel truth. You're not who you think you are. And yet I knew that was true. I wasn't who I thought I was. I was something else, something more. Something broken and battered, but still standing. I looked up at the sky, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. Maybe it was just an illusion. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But for now, it was enough. I closed my eyes, letting the sun's warm rays wash over me. And in that moment, I knew that I would be okay. I would find my way again, no matter how long it took. The patient may have broken me, but I had survived. And that was all that mattered.